Okay, Module 14, Module 15. Module 15, Reassessment of Global Dominance. 2010 to the present, 2015. So now we're going to look at what has happened in the past 8 or 9 years, both in the world and in terms of American relationships with the world. Obama promised to end the war in Iraq, but in many ways he inherited the Bush foreign policy. And many of his observers and even critics said that despite the fact that he ran in 2008 on a platform of ending the Iraq War, that he really, his foreign policy was based on many of the same assumptions as the Bush foreign policy, and there was really no fundamental difference. That it was based on unilateralism, on American exceptionalism, on the idea that somehow there was a new world order that had emerged as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and that we were the top dog and the top gun. Now, you can see from the article by Andrew Bacevich that many people questioned that view. Now, the real turning point comes in, we could say, the year 2010 or even 2011. Now, two things happened in that year. One was the Arab Spring, and the second was the official declaration that the Iraq War had ended. So I'm going to talk primarily about the United States rather than give you a sort of a background of the world, because we've already talked a lot about that, but I'll sort of talk about it as we go. Now, the Arab Spring really began, as the term implies, in the spring of 2011 with a young man in Tunisia who immolated himself, burned himself to death in protest against the Tunisian government and the oppressive or autocratic methods of the Tunisian government, which were generally true all throughout the Arab world. The secular Arab governments were very, even where there were multi-parties, they ruled with a heavy hand, wealthy people in alliance with the army and business elite. And this was true whether it was Egypt or Tunisia or Algeria or wherever. They were challenged by Islamicists in Egypt by the Muslim Brotherhood, in other countries, in Syria and Jordan, by Islamic fundamentalist organizations. On the one hand, they were challenged by those people. On the other hand, by young democracy, human rights advocates, mostly young people and students. So the Arab Spring soon spread from Tunisia to Egypt, and then to Syria and Jordan and various other countries. But its most dramatic uprising was in Egypt, where young people really used cell phones and online means of communication to communicate with each other and organize protests against the government. And the government of Hosni Mubarak, who was the president, fell. He was replaced by a new group, which really most people think hasn't really changed Egypt that much. Nevertheless, the Arab Spring still is considered a major factor in 2011 in upheaval in the Middle East. Now, the result in Syria and Jordan and Iraq was a little bit more dramatic. In Syria, there was first student protests, but eventually an armed rebellion against the regime of Hafez Assad. He was the son of Bashir al-Assad, his father, who had ruled Syria. The Ba'athist Party was a secular Arab party that was similar to Saddam's party in Iraq. So this armed rebellion was not able to overturn the regime of Bashar al-Assad, but I'm sorry, of Hafez Assad, but it still put up a strong resistance. So there was a protracted civil war where the insurgents weren't able to overthrow the government, and the government wasn't able to squash the insurgents. The insurgents were deeply divided among several different factions of different political complexions. Meanwhile, the government of Nouri al-Maliki in Iraq struggled to try to unify the country, which you remember was divided between Kurds and Shia and Sunni. And then in addition to that, there was a new Islamic militant group that began to question. And Iraq had really been devastated by a civil war that began under Saddam, that continued when the Americans invaded, that continued after the Americans put Nouri al-Maliki in place as their chosen leader. And so Iraq was really just a divided, devastated country, racked by war, and a whole generation of young men grew up amid violence and destruction and social disruption and lack of real education or economic opportunity. And all of that fed into Islamic terrorism. All of that was a major cause for a lot of young men who felt they had nothing to lose. Take a look at Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Fanon wrote this back in 1961, and it described Islamic radicals and revolutionaries in Algeria against French colonialism. And it was a psychological analysis of revolution, but in many ways Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, which was, as I said, written back in Algeria in the 60s, applied to Iraq in the first decade of the 21st century. And so the result of the Arab Spring was simply to create further ferment and instability in the Middle East. And of course, that also was reflected in Israel's relationship with its neighbors. The continued hatred between the Israelis and the Palestinians was not reduced in any way. There were various individuals that were involved and were intervening in the Middle East. The Middle East is extraordinarily complex. Christian, Jewish, Arabic, different Arabic sects, different ethnic sects, and then added to that mix were the intervention of outside countries, including China, Russia, Great Britain, France, and the United States. So all of those countries were interfering. And so the war in Syria became a proxy war between the Americans on the one hand, the Saudis supported one faction, the Russians were supporting a faction, the Iranians, in particular, the two major countries that were interfering in Syria were Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Iran being a Shiite Muslim country, and Saudis being a Sunni Muslim country, and Iran being a secular theocracy, and Saudi Arabia being ruled by a royal family. So those were the two, principal competitors in the Middle East. And by 2015, let's go back a year. Last year, by 2014, it had resulted, in addition to the Taliban in Afghanistan, which the United States was not able to squash, and Al-Qaeda, which the United States was not able to squash, and which in fact spread outside the Middle East to Africa, there arose an Islamic militant group called the Islamic State of the Levant, sometimes known as ISIL, sometimes known as ISIL or ISIS, sometimes known as by the Arabic word Daesh. and they had the most extreme view of establishing an Islamic caliphate and uniting Syria and Iraq into a state based on Sharia law. And of course they committed all kinds of things that were deliberately designed to shock and provoke the Westerners into intervening, which they did. They decapitated people on television. They, blew up ancient historic sites and religious shrines, destroyed mosques, assassinated even imams and religious leaders, all in order to shock and provoke people. They started in 2014 and they continued in 2015, and as we speak, the influence of the Islamic State continues to grow and spread, and the United States has been able to has confronted them militarily with bombings and with its own proxy agents to fight, but they have not been able to really squash them. Meanwhile, they have sympathizers in Nigeria, where there's an Islamic group called Boko Haram, in Somalia, where there's an Islamic group called Al-Shabaab, and the Islamic militant group has spread to Kenya, where there have been a number of terrorist attacks. The Islamic group in northern Nigeria, Boko Haram, has been responsible for hundreds of deaths in the past year. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, the Islamic terrorists in Africa have really not been given the same degree of sympathy and attention as the Islamic terrorists in the Middle East, or for that matter in Paris, where the murder of 6 Frenchmen provoked a huge international outcome, but people seem to ignore Africa. So as we speak, Islamic terrorism continues very strong, very unabated, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of Muslims do not think this way, do not sympathize with them, and lead, lives like everybody else, and believe very deeply in the principles of Islam and the teachings of Muhammad, which really talk about peace and God as a gentle, compassionate God, and do not share this program of ISIL.